Good afternoon, everybody. I believe we are set to start this science briefing this afternoon. My name is Liz Whiteman. I'm privileged to serve as Executive Director of the California Ocean Science Trust. And I'd like to extend my welcome to this science briefing on kelp forest benefits, loss, and restoration along the California coast, presented in partnership with Assembly Member Al Murasucci. California Ocean Science Trust is a nonprofit organization dedicated to convening science expertise to accelerate progress towards a healthy, equitable, and productive coast and ocean. This briefing is being offered as part of our new Science Services program for the California Legislature. For more information on this and to sign up for our newsletter to get notices about events like this, please visit our website, and I believe my colleague will also be putting those details into the chat for your reference. We have a great panel of science experts today, and so without further ado, we have planned plenty of time to field your questions, and I would just send a quick request to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions rather than the chat function. And so with that, I'd like to move just straight ahead and introduce our moderator, Dr. Marissa Baskett from UC Davis, to introduce the topic and the panel. Thank you so much, Marissa.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody. As Liz said, my name is Marissa Baskett. I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. Just to quickly introduce myself, my own research is on understanding the drivers of resilience and adaptive capacity in our coastal ocean systems, including in kelp systems, and how management might account for and protect that type of adaptive capacity. And what I am going to do is provide a very quick overview of our topic of today, the decline of kelp on the north coast of California, and then give our panelists each a chance to introduce themselves and start us off with our questions. So for that overview of our topic today, as many the people joining today, I'm sure know, kelp form underwater forests here off the coast of California. They are essentially the redwoods of the sea. They provide food and habitat for a whole variety of species, and those include commercial and recreationally fished species, as well as support local tourism and coastal communities. And recently, off the north coast of California, what's been called a perfect storm of events has caused over a 90% decline of the kelp during 2014 to 2016, and concomitantly a rise of the purple urchins that graze on the kelp, and those have formed urchin-dominated barrens. And that's happened for two main reasons. One, in 2013, there was an outbreak of disease in the sea stars that eat the purple urchins. And then in 2014 and 2016, there were marine heat waves, extremely high temperatures that stress out kelp and also promote urchins. So following that kelp decline, because red abalone were starving from lack of food from the kelp, there has been a closure of the recreational red abalone fishery. The red sea urchin fishery, that's a distinct species from the purples, had their landings decline by 80%, and it's been declared a federal fishing disaster. And that's all on the north coast. There have also been kelp declines on the central and south coast, but to a lesser degree, in part because it's a different species of kelp on the central and south coast, and in part because there are more predators of the purple sea urchins. So right now, what is happening is that removal of purple urchins as part of kelp restoration is underway, and that's being led by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Ocean Protection Council, an array of partnering NGOs and citizen groups. OPC and Sea Grant have also recently funded a series of seed grants to further the scientific understanding of the drivers of and solutions to kelp loss. These are all necessary first steps, but we also have a number of scientific questions remaining about the most effective strategies for restoring our kelp forest systems, and that's what we're hoping to talk about today. And so with that, let's introduce our panelists who are going to be answering some of those questions. Mark, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks, Marissa. I'm Mark Carr. I'm a marine ecologist and a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. My lab and I have been studying kelp forest species and kelp forest ecosystems for about 3 decades now. And of course, like many other programs along the coast, we're currently really interested in understanding better what's driving both patterns of loss and potential recovery of forests here in Central California in particular.
Thank you, Mark. Carrie, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Marissa, and good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be with you all. My name is Carrie Pomeroy, and I'm a research social scientist with the Institute of Marine Sciences at UC Santa Cruz. I'm trained in anthropology and sociology, along with marine policy. I worked as a California Sea Grant Extension Specialist for about 15 years, conducting research, education, and outreach, and continue that work with a focus on the human dimensions of fisheries in California, including those dependent on kelp ecosystems, among other topics, including having done some research along the north coast of California and soon heading back up that way to engage with folks in those communities. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all this afternoon and look forward to the dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. And finally, Adriana.
Hi, everybody. So I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia. My name is Adriana Verges, and I'm an associate professor at UNSW in Sydney. My research is on the impacts of climate change in marine ecosystems and kelp and seagrass restoration. So here in Sydney, I've been leading a project for the last 10 years where we have successfully reversed local extinction and brought a species of kelp that used to be here but disappeared. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. So we have a starter question from Assembly Member Marisucci. So we're going to start with that question, but please do start entering your questions as well. And remember, please do use the Q&A and not the chat to enter those questions. So our starter question is, what is known or not known about the potential for restoration to serve as a solution to the kelp crisis? And we'll let Mark start.
Thanks, Marissa. So with respect to the knowns, we know that there are particular elements of restoration based on our understanding of the role of kelp loss. And so we have a good understanding of those things that need to be achieved in order to facilitate recovery. And I'll mention that in large part, there's sort of 3 aspects of that. One is knowing that the loss of kelp forests was associated with changes in the behavior and abundance of purple sea urchins. We know that purple sea urchin numbers have to be reduced and their foraging behavior change in order to provide opportunities for kelp to recover. We secondly know that, that the kelp has to be available, whether that's facilitated by people outplanting kelp or protecting natural sources of kelp spores that would reestablish forests. And we also know that to be successful, whatever restoration effort is made needs to be persistent through time. And an important element of that then is ensuring that once urchin numbers are reduced, they need to continue to be reduced. And we need to make sure that the conditions that are favorable for kelp production persist as well. How each of those are achieved is where the unknowns come in, right? What is the most cost-effective means of reducing urchin numbers? What's the most cost-effective means of perhaps outplanting or facilitating the delivery of spores to urchin barrens areas? And what's the best way to ensure the abundance of predators with continued control of urchin numbers? Those are the things that the scientists now are trying to explore.
Thanks, Mark. Carrie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, and thanks. I will jump in and pick up on, in part, on Mark's reference to cost-effective restoration and what that means in my world, where I think about the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of coastal and marine communities, human communities, and the like, it's thinking about what actually constitutes cost, who is to bear the cost, and how our efforts to be identified, evaluated, and sustained over time, since these efforts actually have to be accomplished by human beings. And we have a robust scientific community. We have strongly engaged coastal communities, tribal and non-tribal entities very much engaged. But I think there are some careful considerations that need to be identified and brought into play in identifying what can be cost effective, evaluating cost effectiveness, and making some decisions about best ways to move forward, and acknowledging that change costs something, and change redistributes the good, the bad, and the ugly among different groups of people and different parts of our larger system. So some awareness of that, building better understanding of that, I think could be helpful in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Adriana?
So from more of a global perspective, what I can say with regards to the potential for restoration of kelp is that it is possible. It has been done all over the world. However, kelp restoration as a field is really quite young. So most efforts to date have been experimental and small scale, so less than a hectare. The scale of the problem that we're facing, not just in California, but globally, is much larger. So the challenge here is how to scale up some of these things that we know work at a small scale. And that is, I think, where the unknowns come, as Mark was referring to. The only one thing, so I'm part of a review paper where we have synthesized all kelp restoration efforts around the world for the last 60 years, hundreds of studies. The one factor that seems to be linked to success is proximity to a nearby kelp forest. So that's the only one thing that we know is going to make it a little bit easier, which means, and this should be obvious, but protecting the kelp forest that we still have should be, the top priority, as well as restoration.
Excellent. So we have our next question from Ray Furum, asking, would you consider kelp farming using local kelp genetics and sustainable harvest methods as kelp restoration? I think Mark might speak to that in California, and Adriana, kind of whether that's been implemented globally. Shall we go with that?
Sure. I'll start with the application of kelp farming as an element of restoration. And generally speaking, they're considered two really different objectives, right? I mean, I think the interest that we have generally in the scientific community and with respect to the department is to try to reestablish the natural beds of forests along the coast as soon as possible. And that's distinct from an explicit effort to farm kelp for the various products and purposes that one would farm kelp. Having said that, one learns a great deal about kelp farming with respect to the conditions that are necessary for kelp reestablishment as well. And there may be integrated approaches to that where you might integrate a kelp farming effort with as seeding an effort to hopefully facilitate a broader scale reestablishment of natural beds. But I don't know of anybody who's actually used that particular approach, that potential integrated approach. Typically, the two objectives are distinct from one another.
Thanks, Mark. Adriana, did you want to add anything to that, or shall we leave it at that?
No, I agree with Mark. Perhaps in Japan and in Korea, there are places where they do both restoration and kelp farming for food. And I think that they are, sometimes they do combine, say, artificial reefs with some seeding using some of the techniques that are used commercially. I do think that that knowledge can be really valuable. And I think one of the challenges for us working in the Western world is gaining some of that expertise and knowledge from countries in Asia, where they're more advanced in terms of commercial applications and farming. But I think as the question already points to the fact that one advantage of using seeding is that you can manipulate the genetic diversity of the populations, which I think is actually quite an interesting proposition, given how fast the climate is changing and the potential benefits of increasing that diversity.
Yeah, and adding on that, when I mentioned earlier that there were a series of seed grants funded by California Sea Grant and Ocean Protection Council on furthering the science behind kelp restoration activities in California, a few of those are looking at kelp cultivation for both reseeding or outplanting, and focusing on genetic diversity in those processes to think about future adaptive capacity to climate change. So that is certainly an active area of research right now. So our next question is from Liz Parati asking, can Dr. Verges briefly describe the declines in Australian kelp and how that is similar and different to the declines in the California current?
So there are some similarities and some dissimilarities. We have had heat waves that have had a major impact and have wiped out hundreds of kilometers of coastlines of kelp. We haven't had the exact problem of the predator of the urchin having the disease, so that is kind of unique. But we have had the heat waves impacting the kelp directly, and we certainly have a problem with the urchins. So it's a different species of urchin. In Tasmania, for example, giant kelp forests have declined by 90%, and that's partly due to a grazing by urchins problems, but it's also due to just the warm waters having an impact on the kelp itself. So there are lots of similarities, and it's the same in Japan, in the Mediterranean, in Korea. So this is a global issue.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add anything to that before we? Great. So I believe our next question is from Brandon Barney, who is asking, oh, should we? Okay. I'm getting feedback on questions. From Brandon Barney, who is asking, says, the COVID-19 crisis has prompted massive federal spending. California's representatives have reached the highest place of power in U.S. government. Will this enable us to get resources from Biden New Deal, the West Coast for California's bulk kelp restoration? So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that one. I'm not sure this group has the expertise to know the political landscape that's going on there. Carrie, do you know, or?
Not precisely and not directly, but one of the things that I am aware of, having spent quite a bit of time working for California Sea Grant and familiarity with the way the Sea Grant mechanisms work, is, Sea Grant is California Sea Grant and USC Sea Grant here in the state of California are part of a national program with funding that comes through NOAA and congressional appropriations. And if this gets on their radar, and I'm at the moment just drawing a blank as to whether or not that's the case, but if this is on their radar, there could be some additional funding that could come through on top of what has already been provided, for example, by California Sea Grant. So that's one mechanism, and there are a number of other mechanisms. The other thing to think about too is where this may also be occurring besides California, and opportunities for partnership to get it put up at the national attention level. Thank you.
Great. We also had a question from Liz Purdy mentioning we can't quite eat our way out of the urchin problem. Is sea star, the Pycnopodia sea star, the sunflower star that declined due to that sea star wasting disease that had the outbreak in 2013, is restoration of that part of the solution? How are sea stars recovering in Central California compared to elsewhere? I will just quickly slip in that again, one of the grants that was funded by Sea Grant and Ocean Protection Council that's out of UC Davis is actually looking at questions of sea star reintroduction, and that is certainly discussion also by NGOs and other entities of whether or not that might be part of the solution. A key question there that we're looking to answer scientifically is that the urchins, once urchins dominate and form a barren, they go empty. They don't have meat inside. They're kind of they're dormant, like a hibernating bear, but also there's almost no nutrition in them. And so a huge question is, if you put in sea stars, will they eat those urchins? And we don't know that. And so that's one thing that's being scientifically tested right now, whether or not that's the case, because that determines what's the right sequence of events there. Do you have kelp repopulate and then reintroduce the sea stars, or can you reintroduce the sea stars before the kelp have fully recovered? For Central California and how the sea stars are doing, I will pass that one to Mark.
Right, so so Liz asked a whole bunch of different questions in one shot, and I'll try to work our way through that. The first point that Marissa responded to was this question about, can we eat our way through the problem? And as Marissa pointed out, unfortunately, once you get such large numbers of purple urchins in these barrens environments, they themselves start starving. And so but they do not starve to death necessarily. So unfortunately, the condition of the urchins declines dramatically, but that doesn't necessarily reduce their numbers. Because the condition declines, that means that they're really not marketable as other urchins. There's not sufficient gonad material within those urchins to make them marketable. And unfortunately, that also pertains to the role, as Marissa was saying, of other predators in controlling those urchins in the barrens as well. So one study recently done here in Central California has shown that sea otters will not feed on urchins within barrens for that very same reason. They don't have sufficient nutrient value to spend their time foraging on those urchins. But importantly, what they do instead is the sea otters focus their foraging effort in the remaining forests. And it looks like perhaps on the fronts of urchins at the edges of those forests. And in doing that, what they're doing is they're protecting the persistence of the remnant forests in Central California. And again, as Marissa alluded to, this and Adriana as well, this is a very important function because for these barrens areas to eventually recover to a forested state, we need a source of spores to contribute to reseeding those barrens once the urchin numbers go down. So what the otters are doing is they're protecting those spore sources so that when, for whatever reason, urchin numbers decline, we have these nearby sources of spores to reestablish the forest. And then I'll just quickly mention that like Northern California, Southern California, and Mexico, Pycnopodia, which is the sea star that is the voracious predator on urchins, it has yet to recover from the sea star wasting disease in 2013 here in Central California, as well as the rest of the state. So it's bleak with respect to so far the natural recovery of that important predator in the system here as well.
Yeah, and to add on to that, in thinking about sea star reintroduction, a lot of that population would likely come from up north, and so it's the University of Washington that's actually conducting those trials on will the sea stars actually eat those urchins. So Sheila Siemens asks our next question. Can you speak to the restoration efforts in Mendocino and Sonoma County, where we have no predator and the sea stars are the seas themselves are difficult in winter months? Does somebody else want to jump on that, or? Because I can speak briefly to that, but I'm happy to defer.
Why don't we go ahead? Marissa, go ahead and I'll add on to.
Okay, great. So the restoration efforts currently happening in Mendocino and Sonoma County are focused on urchin removal. And so they are employing red sea urchin divers, because they've got the expertise how to do this, to go and pull out the purple sea urchins. And Reef Check is helping to coordinate that with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as Ocean Protection Council, as well as coordinating the post-removal monitoring to look at how successful that is. And those locations where they're doing that are built in part around picking locations with existing kelp, just like Adriana and Mark emphasized as a really important factor, as well as where closeness to ports where it's more feasible, and that will then help recovery of fisheries that support our coastal communities. And so and that challenge of actually being able to get out there given rough weathers, as well as the challenge of monitoring. When you have a lot of fog and cloud cover, satellite monitoring is hard. It is a major challenge on that north coast, but it's also a priority by CDFW and OPC.
And I'll just follow up with emphasizing what Marissa just mentioned and relating to my earlier comment, which is, as she said, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is collaborating with various other groups to conduct these urchin eradication efforts. And there's two elements of that. One is to what extent that is scalable to be of sufficient size to actually have a lasting effect that's long enough to allow the actual recovery of a forest. And it's difficult because urchins are very mobile, actually. And the problem that we've faced historically is you can remove urchins from an area, but they rather rapidly recolonize that area prior to the ability of the forest to reestablish. I think one of the important lessons learned from that work, though, as Marissa mentioned, is recognition of the importance of targeting that effort in places like our friends the sea otter in Central California that contribute to the persistence of remnant forests. So you probably have a bigger bang for your buck by removing urchins that are impinging on these remnant forests so that you can contribute to the persistence of those forests as spore sources, as opposed to just clearing areas and hoping that that there is in fact a supply of spores to those areas, and that the reduction of urchins is of a duration that will allow the plants to reestablish.
Great. And I want to give another friendly reminder. Please do put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, because that's where they're going to feed into this. So we have Kevin Wildren asking, how much is known about carbon sequestration from kelp forests? I'm not sure whether Adriana, is that an area you've covered, or Mark?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So the thing about seaweeds and kelp is that they grow extraordinarily fast, and everything, all the biomass is photosynthetic, right? So that's why there's, they're much better at capturing carbon, or much faster than terrestrial forests. So we know that they capture a lot of carbon very fast. What we know less about is what happens to that carbon. What's the fate of this carbon? So for it to become blue carbon, it means it gets sequestered out of the system for millennia. And the science on this is being worked on. It's still being developed, but we do know that at least a proportion of the carbon that gets captured ends up in the deep sea at depths of greater than 1,000, 2,000 meters. And once it gets to those depths, it doesn't remineralize. It effectively does become sequestered. So because there's just so much kelp in the world, we think that it is a major source of blue carbon, but the actual details are still being worked through.
Yeah, and if I can follow up with that, and again, emphasize some of Adriana's points, which is that the plants are highly productive. There's no question that they're consuming and capturing lots of carbon in the system. But as Adriana pointed out, sequestration requires that carbon goes someplace where it doesn't become available again for a very long time. And we know that much of the production of kelp has one of three potential fates. Well, two really. There's the kelp that remains within the forest, which is then largely consumed by herbivores and detritivores that consume that material and maintain it in their own body carbon for the duration of their lifetime. But again, that's not on the order. That time frame really isn't on the order of what we consider sequestration. More importantly, as Adriana was suggesting, is that it's the large amount of kelp that is exported from the forest where it's produced. Some of that is exported actually onshore, onto sandy beaches, onto rocky intertidal areas, where it plays a very important ecological role, but doesn't have a very long lifetime again as well. And so it's really, as Adriana mentioned, it's the proportion of the kelp that is exported offshore into that much deeper water and eventually incorporated into the sediments. That is the amount of kelp, or the proportion of the kelp that really contributes to sequestration. And so quantifying that is one of the key goals for understanding just how important any of the algae are with respect to sequestration.
All right, so our next question is from Steve Murray. How do the life history and breeding systems of different kelp species need to be taken into account in designing restoration efforts? Mark, you want to start that one off?
Sure. So what Steve's referring to in particular, if people are not aware of it, we've mentioned kelp loss in Northern California, Central California, Southern California, Mexico. And it's important to recognize that the primary canopy forming kelp in Northern California is a species we refer to as the bull kelp, whereas from Central California south, the primary surface canopy forming kelp is the giant kelp. And those two species have very different life histories in this, well, at least with respect to their longevity. So bull kelp is thought to be an annual, where the algae actually turn over. They start within the spring, grow up to the surface, and then are eventually removed the following winter by storms. So the average lifetime of a bull kelp, individual bull kelp, is only on the order of a year or so. Giant kelp is more of a perennial. It persists for multiple years, and individuals, perhaps on the average of 4 or 5 years. Forests more typically persist for 7 years or so. And so as a consequence, those rates of turnover might influence how you would approach a restoration effort, in the sense that restoring a perennial forest like giant kelp, those efforts may persist much longer with respect to maintaining that physical structure and spore production. For the bull kelp, because it's only an annual, its production is likely to cycle more quickly, and and one needs to make sure that there's sufficient spore production each year to establish a bank of spores that will then re-germinate the following year. Hopefully that helped to some extent.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to add anything to that before our next question? No? Okay, so our next question is from Gina Contolini. And Carrie, I'm going to pass this one to you. So she asks, given the kelp forest collapse was not a direct result of human activity, how do you justify large-scale intervention in this system when some stakeholder groups like tribes are opposed to various restoration activities like cooling native species, in this case, the purple urchins? And we're combining that with another question we had on our list, wondering about the broader benefits of kelp to our coastal communities. Carrie, you want to take that away?
Sure, and Gina, thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one. What it helps to highlight is that restoration, the goal of restoration itself, is a social value held by certain groups of people. And there are other types of social and cultural and economic values associated with kelp ecosystems and the coastal setting and the whole 9 yards, so to speak. And I would suggest that I think it's actually critically important, not only because of the tribe's sovereignty, their presence long before, for myself, a European American, long before I ever arrived in California, the knowledge base, the critical social, cultural, and economic ties to the place. Understanding this and being able to incorporate this into decision-making, I think is critically important. And there's sort of an associated challenge with this that is something that we think about, certainly I think about as a social scientist, which is you may have restoration, but restoration to what, where, when, and how. And again, going back to those costs and benefits. But the other issue is, well, what if restoration doesn't work? And in the meantime, there is adaptation by those who have grown accustomed to functioning and deriving livelihood, well-being, and so on from the system as it has existed over the past many decades or much longer. So there's sort of this associated question or set of questions related to understanding the different futures that may portend and the different ideas and preferences or needs that different groups of people may have associated with this challenge. There may be opportunities that come out of this and so on. And the tribes hold a special place in this because of their history, because of their ties to place and so on. And they affect and are affected by the larger set of perspectives and solutions here. So I hope that helps to answer the question. I think the question is a really important one, and there's not an easy answer to it, but I think it's a question that needs to be front and center, and it needs to be addressed through deliberate engagement as well as social scientific effort or appropriate effort vis-a-vis these different value systems and needs and sources of livelihood and well-being associated with the kelp forests. Thanks.
All right, Mark, you want to add on to that?
I do, and I'm going to make a comment that will segue to Adriana, actually, and it's actually pertaining to Gina's initial comment about kelp forest collapse not being directly a result of human activities. That is in part true, but in part not true. So we, to this day, I don't think really know very clearly to what extent sea star wasting disease was associated with any human influence. But we do know that both the gradual increasing ocean temperatures through time, as well as marine heat wave events, are attributed to global climate change. And I don't say that from my own conclusion, right? This is what I've been told by atmospheric and oceanographic scientists that really study marine heat wave phenomena. and in fact have concluded that they are associated with a broader global climate change in global climate. And so in that sense, in fact, just like we are thinking of human interventions or if not human interventions per se, at least trying to protect the natural mechanisms of resistance and resilience of species and ecosystems to the stressors associated with climate change. There is a role, I think, for humans to think about how are we going to adapt and mitigate these consequences of climate change. And I would argue that these restoration efforts might be simply another example of how we're trying to mitigate what we attribute to climate change.
Thanks, Mark. Adriana, did you have anything to add?
Not really. I agree very much with what Carrie was saying, in the sense that restoration, I think it works most successfully when it involves the community as a whole, and that means everybody, you know, different ocean users, obviously indigenous peoples. So if possible, you know, at the start, even the decision of whether to restore or not should be made by the community as a whole. I do agree with Mark that, I mean, I would think that the reason for the kelp forest collapse is very much linked to climate change, which is due to human activities. So in that context, I would argue that doing nothing is also doing something. It's also, in a way, intervening, right? So yeah, these are all things that need to be considered.
And the other human activity involved in this is the historic overhunting of sea otters during European settlement. That is why, one of the multiple reasons why we've seen a greater decline of kelp on the north coast compared to the central coast, where sea otters essentially serve as a backup to the sea stars for eating the purple sea urchins. So moving on to a question from Amy Vieira, asking, taking into consideration the OPC and California Sea Grant research projects that are just getting underway, what are the highest priority science gaps to help to state manage kelp? And I'll pass that to first Carrie and both Mark, because I know that that one of the gaps identified by OPC and Sea Grant after funding those proposals was with respect to a social science element to all of this. So Carrie, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and social science is sort of like thinking about biophysical science. There are many fields, many types of questions, many approaches to those questions, and plenty of diverse motivations, in fact, in the first place for asking those questions. A couple of things that I would highlight would sort of go back to the discussion we were just having, which is understanding the diversity in the human community, if you will, in terms of how kelp or the kelp ecosystem figures into people's well-being. And that can be physical, spiritual, and that interdependence with the kelp system. It's understanding how these different, how the current situation, the status quo, the potential restoration or other types of management or action options might affect different groups of folks, how costs and benefits of those actions might affect people differentially, and where things might land from a social perspective as well as an ecological one. Thank you.
And Mark, do you want to speak to additional gaps following the recently funded grants?
Yeah, you bet. But I would start with the important caveat that I wouldn't overemphasize prioritization. It's clear that that we have knowledge gaps in many different aspects of the restoration effort and conservation and restoration. And so the most productive probably is to obtain what that suite of projects that Sea Grant has funded is doing, as well as TNC and Reef Check and these other programs that are pursuing various elements of restoration. You wouldn't want to overemphasize one necessarily relative to the other, but two of particular importance, I think, are, first of all, predicting, understanding so that we can predict those environmental conditions. And when I say environmental, I mean both the physical, oceanographic environmental conditions, but also the biological communities that are most conducive to successful restoration. And so being able to predict those areas where that are most conducive to successful persistence of a restoration effort will be really important to guiding where restoration efforts are conducted, right? You want to make sure that when someone goes out to conduct a restoration effort, they're doing it at a place where it's most likely to be successful. And so hopefully we'll be able to develop the ability to predict those areas of highest success to inform where these restoration efforts are conducted. The other one I wanted to mention is the genetic work. And so just again, as background for the genetic work, remember that the genetic diversity of a species is really the foundation for its adaptive capacity. And Marissa mentioned this early on in the introduction, but I want to reinforce this point that it's fundamentally important to protect the genetic diversity of any species in hopes that we will have that genetic diversity into the future so that it allows the adaptive capacity of a given species that experiences these changing environmental conditions, right? Without genetic diversity, to adapt to changing conditions. So it's critical that we capture and protect that genetic diversity as quickly as we can. An important implication of that, or application of it actually, is the idea likewise that you capture some of that genetic diversity, for example, in the southern portion of the range of kelp, if in fact it's those genotypes that may be best for restoration work in changing environmental conditions, say in Central or Northern California. So it's capturing genotypes that may be the most successful for restoration efforts and ensuring that we have that diversity before we lose it, right? If we continue to lose forests along the coast of Mexico through repeated perturbations, it'll be important to capture that as soon as we can throughout the range of both giant kelp and bull kelp species so that we have it to apply to these restoration efforts if necessary in the future.
Great, thank you guys. Liz Parati directed her next question to Carrie and asking, Carrie, can you recommend ways to channel this public interest in urchin removal into useful scientifically framed efforts to maximize our learning about removal efforts?
That's a great question. In prep for this, part of what I was thinking about was different ways we do research, especially when it's community engaged research. And you have this continuum, right? You've got cooperative research. Actually, you can start further down the continuum where it's not cooperative, but that's a whole nother story. You have cooperative research where you have a group of researchers, let's say, academic folks or agency folks or whatever, coming to a community or coming to a group of people and saying, hey, we're really interested in doing this research and we could really use your help. Gee, would you take us out on your boat? We'll pay for your fuel. Or would you come and help us do things? Would you come and do the diving for this or whatever? And then there's collaborative research. And that's maybe on the opposite end or the further end of that spectrum. And that collaborative research can take a lot of different forms, but it can start from the point of, gee, we're seeing this thing changing. It's not what we expected, whether we're looking at it from a scientific perspective, a community perspective, a resource user perspective, whatever. It's like, we should get a better handle on this. And then we ought to think about how, based on what we learn about the problem, let's think about what we try to do about that. And so in a sense, the horse has already left the barn in some ways. There are a number of efforts out there already where there is some extensive engagement by divers, whether commercial or recreational, and other interested community members playing a role somewhat more on the cooperative end of the spectrum, but in other cases, more on the collaborative end of the spectrum. And I wonder if there is something to be gained from taking a look at those efforts so far and thinking about the different ways that people are engaged. Not everyone is going to see the problem or engagement with the problem or efforts to address it the same way. They're not going to hold the same values. Not everybody thinks that picnic podia is the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? So sorry, Mark, but it's diverse values, and part of one approach to this, and there's a fair bit of work that's been done on collaborative and cooperative research endeavors. Part of this could be learning from what has been experienced so far, getting a handle on the different approaches that are being used to try to investigate this and work toward restoration or other solutions, and getting a collective network of folks together, essentially, to share these experiences and to build this sort of shared understanding that, yeah, we'll all look at this a little bit differently, but there are ways we can go about this that are going to be particularly useful in trying to understand the problem and find a way forward with it. And so let's see if we can put these efforts together. That sounds a bit Pollyannish, if not just totally vague, but I think there's a lot to be learned from the efforts where a diversity of community perspectives is already in play, and where those perspectives are being heard all around the table, and then think about how that might translate to other contexts and how those experiences might be shared to help bring people along to an appropriate approach. The other thing is, and it sort of relates to my comment I made a moment ago, not everyone is going to be interested in the scientific question. And that's not good, bad, or indifferent. It just is. And so appreciating that that's the fact, and yet some people have a very strong sense of connection to what's happening in the Kelp community, that matters. And so those folks, as well as the folks who are really interested in the scientific questions, need to be engaged as well. Thank you. Quite a ramble.
Great, thank you, Carrie. So we have a really quick question from Liz Allen for Adriana, whether that Kelp restoration review paper you mentioned earlier is published or in preparation. And in particular, I would suggest that if it is available, perhaps post a link in the chat. Is that already out? Okay.
It's in preparation, but we do have the main database publicly available in the Open Science Framework, so I'll send a link.
Excellent, thank you. So we are quickly running out of time. So there were a couple questions around tipping points that we'll try and address together. One is from Steve Rumrow at CDFW asking, can you provide any perspective on how many seasons Nereocystis, our kelp on the North Coast, may be able to persist at very low densities before the site will become depauperate and the spores will fail to recruit recruit. And Danielle McCaskill asked, what is the role of invasive seaweeds to support or hinder the kelp forest restoration in California? Mark, do you want to try those?
Let me do the first one. Well, very quickly, Steve, we don't know, unfortunately, right? I don't think we have any idea of sort of a minimal near bull kelp density that is a tipping point to the loss of the forest itself altogether. But it's certainly ripe for investigation, but you can imagine the amount of variability with respect to the environmental conditions, including the structure of the rocky reef, that would alter what that minimum density is before you actually lose, what that threshold density is. I'm sorry, what was the second question again?
That was the role of invasive species, especially invasive seaweeds, and how do they affect kelp restoration in California?
Yeah, so the primary area where we've observed invasive algae in kelp forest ecosystems is in Southern California to date. And it can be a huge impediment to the recovery of a giant kelp forest. So, and there has, in fact, though, been much work done looking at the effects of different levels of abundance of certain invasive algae on the ability of kelp to recover. And related to that, but different, is also our understanding of what contributes to the resistance of these ecosystems being susceptible to invasive algae as well. And there's been some cool studies. Jen Cassell has done some work in the Northern Channel Islands, showing how the abundance and diversity of urchin predators will influence the resistance of a kelp forest to invasive algae. So simultaneous with just thinking about the impact of the invasive on restoration is thinking about how we prevent invasives spreading in these systems as well.
All right, and we have far more questions than we had time to cover, and a lot of great questions that we're queuing up. But unfortunately, we are at our time and have to wrap up. So I would like to thank all of you guys for serving as panelists today and providing these great insights, and pass it back to Liz.
And I just really quickly want to add my thanks to everybody for joining the conversation today, and to asking insightful questions. And particularly thank you, of course, to our panelists and Assembly Member Al Murasochi. In quick note, this event was recorded and will soon be posted on our website. And again, acknowledging that we had many more questions than we were able to get to today, please do feel free to reach out to us at info@oceansciencetrust.org. And I think my colleague might have a last second to post that. But otherwise, I will just simply close and say thank you again.